Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Welcome back, my fellow seekers. Let me begin by saying, do you seek the mythical land that dwells beneath the restless waves of your original sin? If you do, you must first find Eden. The expectation of New Agers, atheists, and pagan YouTubers has grown too high to the point that they can't even see what's right in front of them, due to their political attitude and distracted by simplistic paradoidal features like the Ricat structure, or taking things too literal and not relying on common sense logic. While the expectation of mainstream researchers are too low and too literal as well, to the point of blinding them to what's right in front of them. There are only a handful of researchers that have started to piece together the enigma of Atlantis. One such researcher is J. Gwyn Griffiths in his book Atlantis and Egypt. Griffiths obtained a master's degree at Liverpool University on the influence of ancient Egypt on Greek religion. Between 1936 and 1937, he was an archaeological assistant with the Egyptian Exploration Society of Sesebe, Lower Nubia. Having studied at Queen's College, Oxford from 1936 to 1939, he obtained a doctorate in philosophy degree from Oxford University on the quarry of Horus and Seth in 1949. He was one of the first mainstream Egyptologists open to the idea of Atlantis, but he has found many misconceptions leading people away from the true origins that inspired what he calls a partial historical allegorical pastiche hypothesis on Atlantis. He has found that Herodotus and Plato were using the Atlantis story as a political allegorical warning to the Empire of Persia. Persia inherited many attributes of ancient Egypt and honored Egypt to the point of wanting to become the Neo-Atlanteans. Griffiths argues that Plato was somewhat implying that Egypt was once Atlantis and learned from its mistakes, whereas the Persians were acting like the original Atlanteans of Egypt. For the Persians even tried to recreate the lost round city-state of Atlantis, for Persia saw themselves as the inheritors of Atlantis and wanted to conquer Egypt, for that was the ultimate geopolitical prize, the Garden of Eden. Persia had created two round palace city-states, one called Gur, built around 550 BC near Farusadad, Iran. Its diameter was about 1.24 miles. The other palace city-state was called Darabagerd, also around 600 BC. Its diameter was 1.13 miles across. If Griffiths is right that Plato believed that Persia was the inheritors of Atlantis, and the architects who built these round cities may have actually had lost ancient scrolls that told of a round capital city-state from Egypt, potentially. And they wanted to emulate that in their own cultural style. So this is where Plato's getting the idea of the round city-state. It's not that Plato knew that there was a lost civilization that had a round city-state, it's that the Persians seemed to be adopting a story that may have been coming out of Egypt. This tradition of the round city lasted all the way up to the building of the round city of Baghdad, Medina as-Salam. He argues that Plato is not saying that Persia is Atlantis. He's saying that Persians were acting like the Atlanteans, for which they may have been coming from Egypt. They wanted to be kind of like Egypt, but in a new way, a more imperial way. The tradition of building a round capital or palace city-state goes back to even in Syria with the round city of Mari, some 2900 BC, although not as big as the Persian cities. This region was part of the Egyptian world order. Mari was a tributary state of Egypt, just as the Minoans were. Other cultures tried to emulate Atlantis, while some diverged and wanted to create more rectangular city-states, which was more simplistic to build. So Griffiths argues that we have to keep Atlantis in the context of the cultures that inherited the Egyptian influence, despite the warring factions. He points out that many attributes that Plato, Herodotus, and Solon describe are clearly coming from Egyptian influence, such as the plain, which researcher Ulf Richter of Schwabenheim, Germany, also notices in his journal article Plato's Atlantis was in a river delta. There are many other clues, for example, the 3 types of stone that Plato mentions. There's white, red, and black. White limestone, red granite, and black diorite. This is what Egypt had in abundance. But there's even a more important clue that Plato gives us. Many New Agers like to spout out how advanced Atlantis was, although they take it to extreme. Griffiths argues that Atlantis was advanced, and the only advanced civilization before Solon was Egypt, for Egypt clearly had the ability to create the Philosopher's Stone.
Gleaming cast metal called Orichalcum, which was said by ancient Greeks to be found in Atlantis, has been recovered from a ship that sunk 2,600 years ago off the coast of Sicily. The lumps of metal were arriving to Gela in southern Sicily, possibly coming from Greece or Asia Minor. The ship that was carrying them was likely caught in a storm and sunk just when it was about to enter the port. Sebastiano Tusa, Sicily's superintendent of the sea office, told the Discovery News that the wreck dates to the first half of the 6th century. It was found about 1,000 feet from Gela's coast at a depth of 10 feet. Officials were able to recover 39 ingots from the sea floor. Tusa noted that nothing similar has ever been found, and that we only knew Orichalcum from ancient texts and a few ornamental objects. Indeed, Orichalcum has long been considered a mysterious metal, its composition and origin widely debated. According to the ancient Greeks, it was invented by Cosmos, a Greek mythological character. In the 4th century BC, Greek philosopher Plato made Orichalcum a legendary metal when he mentioned it in the Critias dialogue. Plato wrote that the 3 outer walls of the temple to Poseidon and Cleito on Atlantis were clad respectively with brass, tin, and the 3rd outer wall, which encompassed the whole citadel, flashed with red light of Orichalcum. The interior walls, pillars, and floors of the temple were completely covered in Orichalcum, and the roof was variegated with gold, silver, and Orichalcum. In the center of the temple stood a pillar of Orichalcum on which the laws of Poseidon and records of the first son princes of Poseidon were inscribed. Today, most scholars agree Orichalcum is a brass-like alloy which was made in antiquity by cementation. This process was achieved with the reaction of zinc ore, charcoal, and copper metal in a crucible. When analyzed with X-ray fluorescence, the 39 ingots were found to be made with 75 to 80% copper, 15 to 20% zinc, and small percentages of nickel, lead, and iron. According to Enrico Matovich, a retired professor of physics who taught at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the ingots are not properly made from Orichalcum. He said that it appears they are lumps of latone metal, an alloy of copper, zinc, and lead. While other scholars equate the mysterious metal to amber and to other copper-based alloys, Matovich believes Orichalcum has its roots in the Peruvian Indies.
Again, our high expectation and perceptions of Atlantis has been so brainwashed by Hollywood and New Agers that we fail to look at the obvious. What seems mundane to us was extremely valuable to the Atlanteans, for this Philosopher's Stone requires 4 elements to forge the pure stone, that is, metal. With water, earth, fire, and air is needed in order to create the 5th element of metal. And it takes a philosopher or an alchemist to be able to figure out that and have the perseverance and the curiosity and ingenuity to create something that would profoundly change civilization, despite the cost being high. The only reddish metal that could have been produced in abundance for the use of many things, unlike gold, would have been the red light of copper. The original Atlantean Egyptians may have been the first to figure out how to extract copper and then form it into alloys, like we see with the so-called Orichalcum. Although in the time of the Romans, Orichalcum later became associated to bronze alloys, but the original metal that gave birth to that was copper. Copper is known to be claded on Egyptian artifacts, so it's highly possible that the use of copper was claded on walls and even Egyptian stelas. Although Plato says a column, more than likely it was a stela, tablet, of a large megalith, where laws were written on. These stela tablets were most likely the type of tablets that Moses had who encountered God at the mountain of the ultimate God, that is at the Great Pyramid, according to Ralph Ellis, who argues that the Great Pyramid was Mount Sinai. So the Great Pyramid or Mount Sinai was claded possibly with Orichalcum, alloyed on the tip, where it had copper and possibly gold infused to it, which could have been attracting lightning to hit the top of the pyramid for aesthetic reasons, not for power plant reasons, but it was maybe the first time that mankind figured out that metal attracts lightning, and lightning is always associated with the characteristics of the gods, of these so-called UFOs, these UAPs, these supernatural creatures that have a metallic-like plasma substance to them. And this is why metal has always been associated as like the blood of the gods, due to its malleability and morphing abilities. And dry lightning is known to happen in the Middle East, although rare. So it's possible that the original Egyptians who built the pyramids may have intentionally designed it to where it could attract lightning. They may have figured out that lightning was a phenomenon. Not necessarily that lightning was a god, but that the gods had the characteristics and attributes of metal and lightning. So copper is our original philosopher's stone. This metal, when churned into an alloy, can be used to cut granite, as shown by the YouTube channel Scientists Against Myths.
Привет!
Hello, I'm Olga Vdovina. I'm a sculptor from the city Kemerovo, Russia. I reenact ancient technologies. I've already demonstrated the method of making an inner angle in a granite block using a piece of flint, just as an ancient Egyptians could have done this. I've already made 2 stone vessels using primitive tools. The second one, the bird-shaped vessel, was made after ancient Egyptian patterns without using even copper tools. This took me more than 7 months. That was very hard work. I'm not afraid of difficulties, and now I'm going to attempt a far harder task. This time I want to make a vessel of diorite, the hardest stone that ancient Egyptians used for this purpose. I will use only the simplest tools made of stone and bone. This experiment will be the first ever in the world. It's hard to figure out how long it will take me, but probably over 6 months. I'll be working the whole week, and I'm positive I'll get a top result. I don't waste my words, you know that. I want to demonstrate what ancient craftspeople were capable of. If enlightenment and fighting against historical fakes matter to you, we invite you to support our experiment. Thank you for your any help.
We have this simplistic idea that only copper tools were used and it was just the tools themselves. No, it requires complex techniques, creative ideas, mechanical devices wrapped up with pulleys and levers and ropes, and using water wheels possibly, and beasts of burden, and complex wooden mechanical devices to be able to spin a wheel and create kinetic motion to cut something continuously. So it wasn't just people doing it by hand. They had clever techniques of doing it. They would have used water, sand, and fire, and powders of pumice to be able to cut through something, and they would have to replace the copper tools, but copper was so abundant they figured out how to mass produce it, the Atlanteans. We also know the Egyptians were able to build massive boats, so it's possible if they built boats back then the pre-dynastic Egyptians or the Atlanteans could have also built these boats, but then that knowledge was lost but then rediscovered as they rediscovered how to make copper and then turn it into bronze. So I do believe there was a lost period in Egypt's past, and they were the original Atlanteans, and the knowledge did have to be relearned, but not all of it was completely lost. You don't just destroy an advanced civilization that quickly. It takes time, but it really never was destroyed, but simply morphed and changed. So the techniques that the Freemasons used to move the obelisk in Central Park and the Column of Alexandria in St. Petersburg would have been similar techniques and devices that the Egyptians may have had, just in a maybe less complex way, but still having a mechanical system of wood and metal to be able to move things with ropes and animals. If people want to claim that Atlantis had advanced technology, then what would be more advanced than the creation of steel, the ultimate philosopher's stone?
The initial results of this study of the 5 anklets bracelets are both exciting and enigmatic. 4 of the artifacts have a structure where there is a uniform distribution of carbon from surface to surface, making them the earliest verified instances of mild steel from Jordan and placing them with a small group of the earliest dated steel from Eastern Mediterranean sites, such as Idalian and Cyprus. These bits of jewellery date to the earliest parts of the Iron Age, 1200 to 1050 BC. That is really early. Think about this, okay? Yet it's not the earliest reference that I have found. One of the earliest ones come from this study, Iron in Anatolia and the Nature of the Hittite Iron Industry, which is from Anatolian Studies volume 35. More striking is the analysis of a small, Middle Bronze Age iron blade from Pella, Jordan, perhaps coming from a miniature notch chisel axe. Made of carburized iron, i.e. steel, it was quickly cooled as indicated by the microstructure, probably by quenching in water, an act which imparts even greater strength to carburized iron. Now they say this is from the Middle Bronze Age. The Bronze Age dates from 2600 BC to around 700 BC. The dates actually are a bit more fluid and debated, and so that previous reference I shared about the jewellery could actually fall within the Bronze Age according to when you define it. Have a listen to some of these other references about steel artifacts being found so early on in history. From Sardis is a tool of the late 11th century BC, which was made by laminating 2 blocks of iron, one carburized and one not. The use of carburized iron steel to strengthen the edges show that the smiths realized the superiority of the carburized product and conserved energy by not carburizing the entire artifact. They are laminating carburized iron and steel. That's folding. They are folding iron and steel together as early as 1100 BC. This is stuff that people laud the Japanese for doing in the 11th century AD, not BC, 2000 years before. Think about the complexity of this and think how early on in history. Now, of course, this was not widespread. Not everyone knew it. Yet, hang on, I should probably rephrase my terminology of widespread, because listen to what this article says in one of the next paragraphs. For Cyprus, however, there exists a considerable body of metallurgical studies which shows that steel was being produced there on a regular basis by at least the 11th century BC. In Palestine too, there is good evidence for the regular use of steel by the 12th century at the latest, with earlier occurrences in the carburized bracelets from burial caves of the Barqua Valley of Jordan. That's from that previous article, you know, the jewellery from the Barqua Valley. That's from that one. The most spectacular find is an iron pick from the 12th to 11th century BC settlement from Mount Adir in the northern Galilee. Almost perfectly preserved, the pick had been carburized, quenched, and mildly tempered, all the treatments known in effective steel production until the 19th century AD, when alloys with other metals were developed. Is your mind blown? Because mine is. This was a pick that was not only properly carburized, okay, not only properly quenched, but properly tempered. Why do you temper something? To make a spring, okay? When you have a high carbon steel and then you quench it and then temper it to give it some ductility. This is some of the most advanced and effective types of steel production. When I was saying the best swords, spring swords, this is what they were making in the 11th century. This pick, and if there is a pick, we can kind of infer that there's a good chance there might be a sword around there somewhere made of the same, would have been a super weapon. It is made in the Bronze Age. This thing could chop bronze swords through in half. Okay, look, exaggeration there, okay? We have seen some bronze weapons put up against steel. Skarlgrim actually tested this. The bronze did not fare very well. There is big, gouges and notches in the bronze from just a steel gladius. But think about this, okay? In comparing these two materials, bronze against steel, the steel would almost seem like it's indestructible. It's not getting any chips or damage because it's going up against bronze, and the same result would be if you're putting it up against iron. And with that, we get a good understanding that steel was invented a long, long time ago. It doesn't mean that everyone knew it, but certain cultures certainly had a fairly common idea, and there's good body of evidence that it was common practice amongst certain cultures. But it makes sense that they might not want to share these secrets. And in actual fact, I kind of envision the blacksmiths and smelters maybe not letting other people know of this almost magical, mystical kind of secret in how to make this super material which can make a sword that seems to be indestructible. You wonder why certain smiths and stuff, like in certain cultures, like in Norse culture, stuff like that, people attributed smiths with certain mystical, magical abilities in what they were able to do. And so it's beneficial for them to keep this knowledge locked away, especially on a cultural level. If you're going up in war against someone else and you can make weapons and armor of a much higher quality because you have better metallurgical, technology, yeah, you can kind of see why they might not want to share it, and why making steel was actually so hit and miss. It wasn't prevalent everywhere, where some cultures had it and some cultures had no idea. And that's why the myth where steel was invented in like the Industrial Revolution, that's really when it became universally or worldwide, or standardized worldwide, where everyone kind of understood it and it truly was public common knowledge. Where before then, there was mystery, and there were people who knew it, but only some people, and there were some people who didn't know it, and they were stuck with bronze and then iron and things.
Now keep in mind, this is all within the Egyptian world order. The Eastern Mediterranean region was part of Egypt's empire, not the nation, but the tributary states that gave resources to Egypt by trade. If steel goes back to at least 2000 BC, who's to say that there might have been a lost period in Egypt's past where steel was invented, but then was lost and had to be rediscovered through trial and error? And the people who survived the catastrophe in Egypt may have retained some of the blacksmith skills to be able to reinvent steel over generations through master and apprentice. But the Atlanteans would not have had abundant amounts of steel. They would have reserved it mainly to the military, and was a closely guarded trade secret. Or possibly only the officers had steel swords, or if they couldn't even produce enough steel for that, it was only used for small tools and ornamentation. So steel still would have been very rare to the Atlanteans, so they had to resort to copper alloys, which are far more valuable because they can mass produce it, and can be used for the construction of megaliths. But the fact that steel was first invented in the Eastern Mediterranean region should make us think that Atlantis has to be near that region. And Egypt is the only culture who had the geopolitical influence and demand for metal going back to at least 3000 BC, if not older. The Mesopotamian city-states were tributary states of Egypt until they succeeded Egypt militarily and through population size. But possibly Atlantis had a monopoly on these philosopher's stones. So we can look to Plato, for he is the closest source compared to other legends like Dwarka, Asgard, and Cholula due to their place attachment authorizations, although Plato is not immune to this due to his nationalist place attachment. For example, Plato does give us another clue, and that is the Trident, which sometimes is associated with the 3 known continents, the 3 points on the Trident, and that is Europe, Asia, and Africa. Although the Triton depiction is a Greek original artistic depiction, its original inspiration may have come from at least 3 different types of Egyptian staffs, the Wa sceptors, and the original name may have been inspired by the lake Tritonus, which also is associated to the place name adoption for the temple city of Tanis in the Delta. Now, the location of this lake is somewhat unclear, but I think we can figure this out pretty easily. The lake is mentioned as being in Libya, a land that the ancient Greeks believed encircled their world. Washed on all sides by the sea, Herodotus said, except where it attached to Asia, and this is the eastern Mediterranean region. Asia was also associated to the Israelite region as well, and the Mesopotamian region. In their knowledge, Libya actually extended from ancient Egypt, the Nile Valley and its basin, but also to Algeria depending on the person who associated to Algeria, and along the south of ancient Egypt. And there's only one lake south of Egypt. Both Herodotus in the 5th century BC and Diodorus in the 1st century AD described the lake, Herodotus giving it an area of about 900 square miles. Herodotus said that there would have been a large river flowing into it, which he called the Trident. Now, what is the artistic depiction of a Trident? Now, when we look to the Indus Valley, we see Shiva with a trident. Clearly, this is an adoption from the Indus Valley and possibly from ancient Egypt because of the association with the snake. And the snake has always been associated with the Nile River, for it actually kind of looks like a cobra, other than the region of the Fayum Oasis that branches off to the left. And this is where sometimes Egypt associates the lotus to the river due to its shape. So the snake and the lotus is association. And this is where the Indus Valley civilization is adopting their religious iconographies. In this lake at the Fayum Oasis called Lake Morelis, and it is about 490 square miles. It was larger at one time, so this is close to Herodotus's potential square footage of 900 square miles. Now, it's hard for them to exactly measure that back in ancient times, so give or take a couple hundred square miles, but this is definitely the only lake that branches off a forked river. The Fork River association is associated to the shape of the delta with the 3 branching rivers into the delta, into the Garden of Eden. And this fork also symbolizes either the head of a cobra, but the idea of a trident or a fork is like the forked tongue of a snake. So these iconographies over time morphed into the idea of the trident. Also, if we take into account to what Donnelly says about Atlantis, he's sometimes associated as Olympus, Mount Olympus, to Atlantis, that the Greek gods came from Olympus, and Olympus is just another Greek interpretation of this lost kind of godlike region, and that would be like Atlantis. And the word Atlantis actually is a closer place name than probably Olympus. But the real inspiration of this Mount Olympus, or like Olympus Mountains, not the one in Mars, but the inspiration of where that came from, probably came from the largest volcano in Africa, and that's Kilimanjaro. That was the original primordial mound to the ancient Egyptians, and I'm talking about the really ancient Egyptians before the Nubians, the Ethiopian ancient Egyptians of Atlantia, that came up into the garden as the Anatolians came down. And Plato hints of this with the idea of Atlantis having the most lofty mountain or mountains, although not around Egypt, but the priest Osiris may have known of Mount Kilimanjaro and spoke of this to the Greeks, and the pyramids could be seen as a recreation of this primordial mound of creation with its volcanic pumice that fertilizes the Nile, although Plato is probably embellishing this specific clue. But Plato does refer to another clue, and that is the mud bars, which could simply be the silty sandbars of the Nile Delta at its entrance. And if they had a major flash flood during the African humid period, this may have blocked parts of the forked Nile rivers that branches off the main Nile, making it impassable to connect back to the Atlantic of its time, that being the Mediterranean, and preventing ships from getting back to the capital of Atlantis, that being Memphis. Researcher Gwyn Griffiths also notices a possible translation error. When Plato says it's larger than Libya and Asia combined, in the original Greek, this also may be implying two things. That yes, it was larger than what was known at the region of Libya, being north of the Atlas mountain range on the coastline of Africa, but also the translation could be hinting, depending on if there's any missing clarity from Plato, and that seems to be the case here, that it's also referring simply that it's in between Libya and Asia, but also larger than the known region of Libya, North Africa region of the Atlas mountain range, and Asia. So that puts Atlantis in between that and larger, referring to the whole of Africa. Also, the suffix is in Atlantis and Memphis may be the only remnants of the name's epistemology, although the original name of Memphis was actually Inebuhedja, meaning the white walls. Again, most likely Atlantis was ringed by walls of a palace moat city-state in a rectangular plain that Plato alludes to, that being the Nile Valley. But even this name is probably not the original name, for Memphis had many different names depending on the rulers at the time. But another clue is the climate. Plato says Atlantis is in a region where the sun is always shining and it doesn't really rain. So it seems there's some misunderstanding from Sontius of Sais on what he's saying. It seems most likely he was always referring to Egypt, coming out of a catastrophe, and the Nile is its savior, once again bringing fertile soil. And I think Plato was also referring to Egypt this whole time, without really naming Egypt, as some kind of political undertone message to the Persians. Kind of like when a politician references a certain country's behavior without mentioning the country due to some diplomatic formalities. This is what I think Plato was doing this whole time, implying that now the Persians are like the Neo-Atlanteans, wanting to war with the Greeks and the Egyptians. So the Egyptians should now be an ally with the Greeks, even though at one time Egypt was an enemy of the Greeks. So he's taking the original Atlantean Egyptian lesson of their empire and applying it to Persia as kind of a propaganda tactic without insulting Egypt. So he includes Egypt as an ally against Persia. This is where translation alone may not be enough, but the tonality and the subtle warning that Plato is inferring with his bilanguage as well. So if people don't understand political and philosophical undertones of allegories, we can miss this innuendo. But to Plato's audience, this was an obvious flattery to Egypt's redemption, and shifting that Judgment Day warning to Persia, because the Persians are not the bad guys. Like he's saying, look at what happened to the Atlantean Egyptians, this could be you, Persia. And to many Greeks who had never had a chance to visit Egypt, this was still a mysterious land across the ocean. One only needs to look to where the Sphinx guards the entrance of the Garden of Eden to find the lost capital hiding in plain sight, as Muhammad Ibrahim says.
Do you think, like in the context of Plato's story of Atlantis, and then there is some was it Heliocropus or something? I do think there is like an Atlantis connection with ancient Egypt. So what was your opinion on that?
My opinion, Plato and Solon, they were students in Egypt, in On, that is the magical, mystical city of Egypt. Mm-hmm. On, the city of knowledge, the city of the sun. And the priest of On told them that one day there was an ancient advanced civilization and disappeared. That is the whole story. He didn't say Atlantis or where or what, and he said ancient advanced civilization and gone a long time ago. So my opinion, he was talking about the earlier ancient Egypt. So Atlantis is ancient Egypt before
cataclysm. Yeah. So what you're saying? So you were saying that Atlantis is ancient Egypt that we've lost.
For sure. And we have the evidences, like the pyramids, the Siren shaft, the Siren temple, the obelisks, the giant monuments, the statue of Ramses II, the Serapeum. Like, we have great evidences proving this story. But they insist that Atlantis is outside Egypt and it is in the Atlantic Ocean under the water. No, it is simply ancient Egypt.
Well, actually, some of the ruins are under the water, at least the recycled reuse of the original stones that may have been cut down to smaller size, from Atlantis potentially. People have always had this sense that Atlantis is Egypt, but they're not willing to go to that next step and say it. From the Freemasons naming the city in Tennessee Memphis in honor of the suspected idea that Memphis was Atlantis, to the Vatican adopting theological ideas and iconographies from Egypt, to the potential occultists inscribing the name Atlantis in the Great Pyramid itself in 1905. The evidence is literally littered all over the place if we only have the eyes to see what's right in front of us, as Abraham points out. It's far more logical that a surgical multi-natural disaster event happened on a palace city-state somewhere around the Cairo region, if not Memphis. Older doesn't always necessarily mean better, although I do think that the event may have happened sometime during the African humid period at the oldest, and I think there are still some philosopher's stones we have yet to discover, or the potential dates of the Egyptian glass may be wrong due to the infusion of local sand. If not that, then the evidence of recent potential meteor impacts in North Africa could be potential evidence. From the Tenumur crater, to the Camille crater, to Mahas crater, to the El Bar crater, the Libyan Soup crater, and even the Burkle crater potentially, or the mysterious depressions off the coast of the Garden of Eden. It's possible that the margin of error of these sites could be off by a few thousand years. I'm not willing to say tens of thousands of years, but maybe a few thousand years. As Randall Carlson hypothesizes, multiple Tunguska level events could have happened, but more research I think is needed on these potential sites in Eden. But I would have to say a major earthquake like an 8.0 or higher, like the one in 1811 for the New Madrid earthquake, would be more damaging than a meteor airburst, unless that airburst happened right over that palace city-state. But the odds of that is very slim unless there was a supernatural intervention, and that may be the case according to Dr. Michael S. Heiser. If there really were these minority mutant 6-fingered 7 to 8 foot tall humans ruling over Eden, created by demonic angels as the Adams and Eves of Egypt ate from that forbidden fruit of dark magic. Some of these genes may still linger, and the evidence could be covered up by intelligence agencies if they saw it as a national security threat. For the Nazis did try searching for these original Atlanteans, born from human sin.
To conclude, as I sit here in my garden, I've learned there are two things that bring about the erosion of a site, and that is water and people. It is people who have eroded the legend of Atlantis to fit to their own political and spiritual narratives. So I ask people like Johanna James, Jimmy from Bright Inside, Ben from Uncharted X, Randall Carlson, and even Robert Sepper, will you continue to erode this legend for your own political and spiritual narratives? However, if you do seek the mythical land that dwells beneath the restless waves of your original sin, then you must first find Eden, as I have. This has been Peter from Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas.